Now sleeps he with that old whore, death. Do thee take this old whore, death, for thy lawful wedded wife? Ernest Hemingway. Norman, born sign of Aquarius, was in Mexico when the news came about Hemingway. He'd gone through the New York Times to read the well-turned remarks of notables. For the most part, never cared about Papa. Not that much. And had one full heart clot of outraged vanity that the Times never thought to ask his opinion. In fact, he wasn't sure he could have given it. He was sick in that miasmal and not quite discoverable region between the liver and the soul. Hemingway's suicide left him wedded to horror. It's possible in the 8 years since that he hasn't had a day which was completely free of thoughts of death. Of course, he finally gave a statement. Norman coughed up what was, in effect, a political statement, inveighing gracelessly on how the death would put secret cheer in every bureaucrat's heart, for they would be stronger now. He had, of course, been thinking that Hemingway constituted the walls of the fort. Hemingway had given the power to believe that you could still shout down the corridor of the hospital, live next to the breath of the beast, accept your portion of dread each day. Now the greatest living romantic was dead. Dread was loose. The giant had not paid his dues, and something awful was in the air. Technology would fill the pause. Into the silences, static would enter. Are we poised for a philosophical launch? There may be no way to do anything less. We'll be trying, after all, to comprehend the astronauts. So forgive Aquarius, then, if he takes mild pleasure at the conjunction of dates. John F. Kennedy had made his declaration concerning the moon not 6 weeks before Hemingway was dead. The nation, Kennedy decided, should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. This is a new ocean, and I believe the United States must sail upon it. Presumably, the moon was not listening. But if she were, in fact, the receiving and transmitting station of all lunacy, well, she had not been ignoring the nation since. 4 assassinations later, a war in Vietnam later, a burning of black ghettos later, hippies, drugs, and many student uprisings later, one Democratic convention in Chicago 7 years later, one New York school strike later, one sexual revolution later. Yes, 8 years of a dramatic, near catastrophic, outright spooky decade later, and we're ready to make the moon. It was a decade so unbalanced compared to previous American history that Aquarius, who'd begun it by stabbing his second wife in 1960, was to finish by running in a Democratic primary for the mayor of New York during the hottest May and June he could ever recall. He came in fourth in a field of 5, and politics was behind him. Now, in the middle of his mayoral campaign, an offer had come in to do a book about the astronauts. Several $100,000, less the pile of crazy debt he had accumulated, would be enough to live and think for about a year. He was weary of himself. He felt not unhappy, mildly depressed, somewhat used up, wise, tolerant, sad, void of vanity. Why, he even had a hint of humility. He might be in superb shape to study the flight of Apollo 11 to the moon. He felt like a spirit of some just consumed essence of the past. And so finally took the liberty to christen himself Aquarius. That was the perfect name for a man who would begin the study of rockets. The water bearer traversed the earth and breathed the air. 3 elements were his medium: solid, liquid, and gas. That was kin to the rocket. Apollo 11 would leave Earth, travel on the combustion of its liquids, and traverse space. What indeed is space, if not the final decompression of a gas? On such unscientific thoughts did Norman, sign of Aquarius, travel. "25 miles south of Houston, on an all but treeless tract of many acres, sits a group of buildings, severe, ascetic, windowless. Passing the guard booth, one might wonder if he were approaching an industrial complex or a marvelously up-to-date minimum security prison. A huge insurance and financing corporation, or the most modern hospital for radiological research. In fact, it is the Manned Spacecraft Center, MSC, the home of the astronauts. It's the place where they're given the bulk of their training in mission simulators and docking simulators. The center from which Mission Control directs and collaborates on their flights. The astronaut's brain on Earth, to nail it thus crudely, when they're up in space. Now, Aquarius, the reporter, tends to sniff out the center of a situation from a distance. But the unhappy truth is, there are no smells coming out of NASA. Nor are the people at work here bound to help him, for they are, by every evidence, part of that vast convocation of Americans whom one sees in New York only on television. They are, in short, WASPs, purchasers of large amounts of deodorant, depilatory, mouthwash, hairspray, and, if they are ladies, arid. No, if the great brain of NASA is attached to any particular sense, it is the eye. The eye is the collector of incontrovertible facts, known at MSC as data points. There are 2 basic types of workers here. There are the physicists, statisticians, and horn-rimmed computer programmers. And on the other hand are the executives, the athlete engineers, the hondos on mission control. They're the instructors and general troubleshooters. Now, both categories of men are absolutely helpful in every way, but in such a way as they're no help at all to Aquarius. There's a style at NASA that he's begun to divine. Every question you ask is answered, and the truth, so far as he knows, is always told. The only flaw is that the conversation can only voyage through predetermined patterns. Technical questions are explained, and voluminous mimeographing of NASA literature, some classified, is available to the press. It's just there's no way to suggest any philosophical meandering. Well, there were exceptions to this uniform variety of experience. He was invited to a pool party in the hot Texas night at the home of Pete Conrad, the astronaut who would command Apollo 12 on the flight to the moon after Apollo 11. And it was not a bad night. Conrad was wiry and feisty, and he could rap without too much of a look over his shoulder for the proprieties. And his wife, Jane, was sensationally attractive in a quiet way. Tommy, their 12-year-old, became forever famous in Aquarius's mind because he obliged a photographer by riding his bike off the slope of the garage roof right into the swimming pool. And the next day, he remembers Conrad saying to him over the outdoor steak grill, "For 6 years, I've been dreaming of going to the moon." And the moon, as a real and tangible companion of the mind, was suddenly there before him. He sees Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins through much of a long day they spend in press conferences with the newspapers, magazines, and television networks, and he learns much. In the absence of a sense of smell, the hairs in his nostrils have begun to quiver at clues. He feels he's begun the study of a new world so mysterious to his detective's heart that he can only repeat what he said on the day the assignment was first offered to him. And that was that he hardly knows whether the space program is the noblest expression of the 20th century or the quintessential statement of our ultimate insanity. It is, after all, the mark of insanity that its mode of operation is distinguished by its logic. Insanity can be more logical than sanity when it comes to attacking a problem. Well, let us make an approach to the astronauts. Aquarius sees them for the first time on the 5th of July, 11 days before the launch. They're in a modern movie theater with orange seats and a dark furrowed ceiling overhead, part of the visitor center. Perhaps 8 rows back of the front seats is a raised platform where television cameras and crews are mounted. From the stage, they must look like artillery pieces on the battlement of a fort. In the front row are 50 photographers, which is to say 50 sets of torsos and limbs, each squeezed around their own large glass eye. Little flares of lightning flash from the bulbs near their heads. The astronauts don't really have to travel to the moon. Life from another planet is before them already. In the middle ranks are several hundred newspaper men and women come to Houston for the conference this morning. They are a curious mixture of high competence and near imbecility. Some, assigned to space for years, seem to know as much as NASA engineers. Others, innocents in for the big play on the moonshot, still are not just certain where laxatives end and physics begins. Now the astronauts come in from the wings and wave at their reporter friends. Once they sit down, however, the mood shifts. Now they're here to talk about a phenomenon which even 10 years ago would have been considered material unfit for serious discussion. Grown men, perfectly normal looking, were now going to talk about their trip to the moon. It makes everyone uncomfortable. Now it's as if they don't know whether they're athletes, test pilots, engineers, corporation executives, some new kind of priest, or sheepish American boys caught in a position of outlandish prominence. My God, how did we ever get into this? It's as if, after months in simulators with knowing technicians geared to the same code languages, they're now debouched into the open intellectual void of this theater, obliged to look into the uncomprehending spirits of several hundred media tools, human, all perplexed and worried at their journalistic ability to grasp more than the bare narrative of what's coming up. Yaws abound, vacuums in the magnetism of the mood. Something close to boredom. So the conference drags on. Well, that was a fair haul for a working day. First, we had the news conference, and then the shakedown by the magazine writers. Aquarius now has a catch to fry. But the astronauts, with dinner and breaks, will be at this for another 6 hours. Each of them to have conversations with each of the 3 television networks. He sits in on the Armstrong session with NBC. The TV interview adds little to the story of Aquarius, but by one detail it does. The interviewer, Frank McGee, referring to a story in Life magazine by Dora Jane Hamblin, speaks of a dream the astronaut would have when he was a boy. In this dream, he was able to hover over the ground if he held his breath. Ever since he read the article in Life, he's been infatuated with Armstrong's recurrent dream. It was a beautiful dream, to hold one's breath and to levitate, not to fly and not to fall, but to hover. It was beautiful because it might soon prove to be prophetic. Beautiful because it was mysterious and profound. Beautiful because it was appropriate to a man who would land on the moon. But Aquarius hated to loose the vigors of his imagination onto the meaning of this dream, unless he could be sure it had actually happened. It was too perfect for his needs to accept it when he'd read it. But after studying Armstrong this day, hearing his near humorous admission that, yes, he had had that dream when he was a boy, There was a quietness at the center of his reply, and he now knows he believes it. And this conviction is not without the most direct kind of intellectual intoxication. For it shows how much at odds might be the extremes of Armstrong's personality, or for that matter, the personality of astronauts. From their conscious mind to their unconscious depth, what a spectrum could be found. It's conceivable that the contradictions in their nature are located at the very impetus of the age. For it's true, astronauts come to live with adventures in space so vast, one feels the infinity of a dream. Yet their time on the ground is conventional, practical, technical, hardworking, suburban. They're patriots, but they're moon men. They live with absolute lack of privacy, but their obvious joy is to be alone in the sky. They're virile men, but they're poked and prodded and tapped into. They're flexed and tested and subjected to a pharmacopoeia of drugs. They're virile, but they're done to. Done to like no healthy man alive. So again, their activity is hazardous, bold, far-flung, demanding of physical strength. But the working conditions call for the ability to live in cramped spaces with passive bodies. The patience to remain mentally alert and physically inactive for days. They live with no ordinary opposites in their mind and brain. To dwell at the very center of technological reality, and yet to inhabit, if only in one's dreams, that other world where death, metaphysics, and the unanswerable questions of the universe lie. Suggests nature so unbalanced that they could be the most miserable of men, unless they contain in their huge contradictions some of the profound and accelerating opposites of the century itself. The century would seek to dominate nature as it's never been dominated, would attack the idea of war, poverty, natural catastrophe as never before. Yet it would create death, devastation, and pollution as never before. Now the century is attached to the idea that man must take his conception of life out to the stars. It's been the most soul-destroying and apocalyptic of centuries. In their turn, the astronauts have personalities of unequaled banality and apocalyptic dignity. They suggest in their contradictions the power of the century to live with its own incredible contradictions and yet release some of the untold energy of the earth. A century dedicated to the rationality of technique has also been so irrational as to open to sane and sober minds the real possibility of global destruction, of being the first century in history which doesn't reach the end of its span. It's a world half convinced of the future death of our species, yet half aroused by the apocalyptic notion that an exceptional future still lies before us. So it's a century which moves with the most magnificent display of power into directions it cannot comprehend. The itch is to accelerate. Metaphysical direction? Unknown. In the dark before dawn on the 16th, in the black hour of 4 a.m., the night a wet and lightless forest in the nose, he's finally scared. It's not unlike waking up in a convoy with invasion of a foreign beach scheduled for the hours ahead. An awakening in the dark he'll always remember, for such nights live only on a few mornings of one's life. Somewhere, not too far from here, the astronauts are getting up as well, and the ghosts of old Indians. In that long ago of prairie spaces, when the wind was the message of America, Indians had lived beneath the moon, stared at it, lived in greater intimacy with the moon than any European. The wind echoes through the abandoned launch towers of the Cape, resonates across 2,000 miles to grain elevators beside railroad tracks in the mournful, empty windings of the West. The country had been virgin once, an all but empty continent, with lavender and orange in the rocks, pink in the sky, an aura of blue in the deep green of the forests. Now, not 4 centuries even spent, the buffalo are gone, and the Indians. The air stinks with every exhaust of man and machine. And all the while, we've been composing our songs to the moon. But the moon, by every appearance, knows more about disease and the manifestations of disease than the oldest leper on earth. Of what can you dream, says the moon? I am battered beyond belief, and you think to violate me now? Later, out at the press site, the Saturn V is visible across the near distance of 3.5 miles. as close as anybody gets except the launch crew and the astronauts. A squad of floodlights play upon it, beams reflecting down through a thin haze onto the surface of the lagoon. A bending and glancing of rays worthy of a diamond on a mirror. While behind it, heat lightning flickers with almost the steady consistency of a lighthouse beam slowly turning. What a vehicle is the spaceship. Planetary traveler, massive as a destroyer. Delicate as a silver arrow. On October 27th, 1967, out at Launch Complex 34, during a pilot manned checkout of spacecraft 12 mounted atop Saturn I booster number 204, there was a fire in the cockpit. Before the hatch could be opened, Roger Chaffee, Gus Grissom, and Ed White were dead. One could look for the villain everywhere, even in the White House. There were those who whispered that the bag, if ever opened, would blast President Lyndon Johnson to the moon, and several high-ranking NASA and Space Committee members with him. But North American weathered the examinations and condemnations of the Apollo 204 Review Board. And the company kept the contract to build Apollo rockets. Yes, one could look for the villain everywhere. Could chase the deaths of those three men down all the lobbying corridors of the Capitol. But no engineer could be sure it wouldn't have happened anyway, for a wrench left behind by a workman was found near some wires, whose insulation may have been bruised by the opening and closing of the hatch. It needed only one minor short circuit in that capsule full of pure oxygen. One evil spark. Well, whatever the cause of the fire, it's certain that everyone at NASA and all the corporations attached to the project has worked in a different way since. The hundreds of thousands working on Apollo rockets now had a holy task. They had the most serious and honorable work of anyone in the nation. Until now, corporate effort in America has been mainly immense and petty, or immense and noxious, or immense and depressing, stirring in the worker the loneliness of meaningless effort. Here at last was American capitalism attached to a corporate activity at once momentous, dangerous, awesome, and a palliative to dread. It isn't as if NASA has done a perfect job. There are critics enough to accuse it of timidity on the one hand and rash acceleration on the other. No one can deny that once they recovered from the 20-month paralysis following the deaths of the three astronauts, NASA accelerated its flight schedules at so inhuman a pace that one has to suspect that they thought if they did not make the moon in '69, achieve the dead and martyred president's directive to land a man and return him safely by the end of the decade, that indeed there would be no landing at all and the end of all space effort. From October 1968 until 9 months and a few days later to this launch of July 16th, 4 flights in all have been made. Apollos 7, 8, 9, and 10. Flights on 60-day centers. Flights rotated so quickly that the lessons of the last mission could hardly be cataloged, much less absorbed and employed before the next flight was ready. Perfectionists could have spent 6 months recovering from the 50 mishaps of Apollo 7 alone. But this was October 1968. This was the year in which the war in Vietnam became a debacle. Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were killed, and Lyndon Johnson abdicated. So NASA barreled ahead. Gone were the days when Gemini flights were regarded as stunts with the bad publicity. Gone were the horrors of the investigation of the fire. The sense of waiting for a blow-up had passed. Space was no longer on a corporate effort so much as a coordinated effort to produce the finest achievement in every detail. A massive holy wedding of the entrepreneur and the engineer produced a massive vehicle, tested and retested, checked and rechecked, triumphant in the 4 mighty flights of Apollo 7, 8, 9, and 10, and now ready to demonstrate before the world that man could indeed land on the moon. What a mighty congregating, what a streaming of workers and techniques toward the base of the rocket as it had stood that last week on its launching pad. What a huge effort to lift Apollo 11 from the ground. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.